Before law, before justice, before redemption, there was only survival. This is Frontier Chronicles, where untold Western tales are carved in dust, lead, and silence. If this story grabs your soul, show you're not just passing through. Hit that like button and ride with us into legend. The blood was still warm when Sheriff Tom Brennan found the 3 bodies scattered like broken dolls across the Silver Dollar Saloon floor. Dutch Henderson, Billy Marcos, and Old Pete. All dead, all burned, all exactly as she had predicted 12 hours earlier. In the town of Copper Falls, they whispered about the woman who spoke to shadows. They called her mad, dangerous, cursed. But when her lips moved and the future spilled out like blood from a wound, even the bravest men learned to listen. Because Evangeline Thorne didn't just see what was coming. She was the storm itself. And what happened that terrible night in October would prove that some prophecies are written in blood, and some women are born to be oracles of death. But to understand how a single word from her lips could save an entire town from massacre, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to the day she arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back and eyes that had already seen tomorrow's horrors. What you're about to witness is the true account of how one woman's cursed gift saved an entire frontier town from annihilation. This is the story that newspapers refused to print, that historians buried in dusty archives, that the government wanted forgotten. But every word of what follows actually happened in the autumn of 1887, in a place where the law ended and prophecy began. The first time anyone saw Evangeline Thorne, she was standing in the middle of Main Street during a dust storm, her black dress whipping around her like smoke, her eyes wide and white as bone. She pointed at the Silver Dollar Saloon and spoke in a voice that cut through the wind like a blade. "Fire," she said. "Fire that eats 3 men and leaves only ash." Now you have to understand, the townspeople thought she was just another drifter, touched by too much sun and too little water. These were hard people, frontier people who'd seen enough madness to recognize it on sight. But that night, when the oil lamp fell and the saloon burned to cinders, taking Dutch Henderson, Billy Marcos, and Old Pete with it, their laughter died in their throats. What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about the natural order of things. Sheriff Tom Brennan found her the next morning, sitting on the charred steps like she was waiting for something. Her dress was still clean, still black, and her eyes held that same empty stare that made grown men cross themselves. "You start that fire?" he asked, hand resting on his pistol. She looked up at him, tilted her head like a bird hearing distant thunder. "Fire starts itself, Sheriff. I just see the spark before it catches." That was the beginning, and what followed would prove that some women are born with gifts too terrible to ignore. Within a week, word spread through Copper Falls like wildfire itself. The strange woman could see death coming, could taste tomorrow on the wind, could read fate in the dust devils that spun through the desert. They called her the Oracle, the Witch, the Devil's Daughter. But Evangeline Thorne just called herself tired, and she had no idea that her greatest prophecy, the one that would save them all, was still to come. Now, what I'm about to tell you next will sound impossible. But remember, this is the Wild West, where impossible things happened every day, and where a woman's curse could be more powerful than any man's gun. 2 weeks after the saloon burned, Mayor William Hayes called a town meeting. The wooden church was packed tighter than a cattle car, every face turned toward the woman who sat in the back pew, hands folded, eyes closed like she was praying or sleeping or listening to voices no one else could hear. This is where the story takes its first dark turn, because what Evangeline said next would prove that her gift wasn't just about seeing death. It was about speaking it into existence. "We can't have this," Hayes declared, his voice booming off the rafters. "This woman is disturbing the peace, creating panic. I say we escort her to the county line, and blood on your hands, Mayor." Evangeline's voice was soft, but it silenced the church like a thunderclap. She stood slowly, those white eyes opening, fixing on Hayes like she was looking right through his soul. "Blood on your hands by Sunday. Your wife's blood, your children's blood, all because you wouldn't listen when the earth tried to warn you." Hayes laughed, but it sounded forced. "You threatening me, woman?" "Not threatening," she replied, "just seeing what's already written in the rocks." What happened next still haunts the survivors of Copper Falls to this day. Sunday came with an earthquake that split the ground like God's own axe. The Hayes house, built on unstable ground that every local miner could have warned about, collapsed like a house of cards. Margaret Hayes and her 2 young sons were crushed beneath the timber and stone. And when Sheriff Brennan found Mayor Hayes kneeling in the rubble, his hands bloody from digging, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face, the terrible truth became clear. Evangeline Thorne wasn't just predicting the future. She was reading it like a book that had already been written. After the earthquake, the people of Copper Falls found themselves caught between fear and need. They were terrified of Evangeline Thorne, of her empty eyes and her voice that carried tomorrow's grief. But they were more terrified of not knowing what was coming. Dr. Martin Crowley was the first to approach her with a request. His wife was pregnant, struggling, and he'd already lost 2 children to the harsh frontier life. Can you see if she'll make it?" he asked, standing in the doorway of the abandoned boarding house where Evangeline had taken up residence. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded toward the chair beside her bed. "Sit," she said. "Tell me about the dreams she's been having." "Dreams? The ones about water, about drowning. She's been having them, hasn't she?" Crowley's face went pale. His wife had mentioned those exact dreams, but he'd told no one. "How did you?" "Because the baby knows," Evangeline said simply. "The cord is wrapped too tight. She'll need help, or they both drown in their own blood." Dr. Crowley delivered his son 3 days later, using techniques Evangeline had described in detail, techniques she couldn't possibly have known unless she'd seen the birth before it happened. Mother and child both survived. Word spread. Slowly, carefully, the people of Copper Falls began to come to her. Not as supplicants or believers, but as desperate humans grasping for any advantage in a world that seemed determined to kill them. It was Martha Sullivan who asked the question that changed everything. She was a widow, raising 3 boys alone, and Apache raids had been increasing in the territory. "Will we be safe?" she asked. "Will my boys live to see another winter?" Evangeline was quiet for so long that Martha thought she hadn't heard. Then slowly the oracle began to speak, her voice taking on that distant quality that meant she was seeing beyond the present moment. 30 riders, she said, coming with the new moon, from the north, following the creek bed. They'll hit the Hendricks Ranch first, then the church, then Main Street, fire and blood and screaming that echoes off the canyon walls. Martha's blood turned to ice. When? 10 days. Can we stop it? Evangeline's eyes focused, looking directly at Martha for the first time. Maybe. If people listen, if they prepare, if they believe. Sheriff Brennan called another town meeting, but this time the mood was different. Fear had been replaced by grim determination. If Evangeline Thorne said war was coming, then war was coming. The question was what they were going to do about it. "We evacuate," suggested Jenkins, the bank owner. "Pack up and head for Fort Collins until the trouble passes." "And lose everything we've built?" Mayor Hayes's replacement, a tough rancher named Samuel Kane, shook his head. "This is our home. We fight for it." Evangeline spoke from her usual place in the back. "Fighting is death. Running is death. Only one path leads to life." "Which is?" Kane demanded. "You give them what they want." The church erupted in angry voices. Give the Apache what they wanted? Surrender their land, their homes, their dignity? "Not land," Evangeline said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Justice." She stood, moving to the front of the church with that eerie grace that made her seem to float rather than walk. "They come for one man, Thomas Whitmore. He killed a chief's son last winter, took his scalp, sold it in Santa Fe for whiskey money. They want Whitmore." All eyes turned to Thomas Whitmore, a grizzled prospector who sat near the front, his face pale as old bones. That's not. I never. You took the boy's hair while he still breathed." Evangeline continued, her voice matter-of-fact. "You made him suffer because you enjoyed the sound. His father has seen your face in dreams for months. He's coming for you, and he'll burn this town to ash to get you." The silence in the church was deafening. Everyone knew Whitmore was a hard man, violent when drunk, but this... "Even if that's true," Sheriff Brennan said slowly, "we don't hand over our own people. Then 30 men, women, and children die for one man's cruelty." Evangeline replied. "Choose." Thomas Whitmore disappeared that night. Some said he ran. Others whispered that Sheriff Brennan had quietly escorted him to the county line. A few suspected darker possibilities. Evangeline spent the night walking the perimeter of town, her bare feet silent on the hard-packed earth. She stopped at specific locations: the old well, the big oak tree, the spot where Main Street curved toward the general store. And at each place, she knelt and placed her hands flat on the ground, as if listening to something buried deep beneath. Dr. Crowley found her there at dawn, her palms bloody from the rough earth, her eyes closed. "Is it done?" he asked. "Will they still come?" She opened her eyes, and for a moment, they weren't white and empty, but deep brown and infinitely sad. "They come," she said, "but not for war, for answers." They rode in exactly as she had foretold. 30 warriors, painted for war, coming from the north along the creek bed. But instead of screaming and fire, they came in silence, stopping at the edge of town like a gathering storm that hadn't yet decided whether to break. The leader was a tall man with silver in his hair and scars mapping his chest like a history of pain. He dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the empty streets where the townspeople watched from behind shuttered windows. Sheriff Brennan stepped out to meet him, hands visible, weapon holstered. The Apache chief spoke in accented English. "Where is the man who took my son?" "Gone," Brennan replied. "Left yesterday." "You lie." "No lie. Check for yourself." The chief gestured, and several warriors spread through the town, searching buildings, checking hiding places. They found no trace of Thomas Whitmore. "He will return," the chief said. "Maybe. Maybe not. If he returns, you send word. To the reservation. You ask for Grey Wolf. You tell him where the killer hides." Brennan nodded. "And if he never comes back?" The chief looked around the town, at the faces peering from windows, at the children clutching their mothers' skirts. "Then he is already dead to me." They left as quietly as they had come, 30 riders disappearing into the desert like smoke on the wind. That night, The people of Copper Falls celebrated. They had faced war and found peace. They had trusted a mad woman's vision and lived to tell the tale. But Evangeline Thorne didn't celebrate. She sat alone in her boarding house room, staring out the window at the desert, her hands still bloody, her eyes white and empty once again. Dr. Crowley brought her food, bandages for her hands, words of gratitude. She accepted the first two, ignored the third. "How do you bear it?" he asked. "Seeing all that pain, all that death, all the time." She looked at him with those hollow eyes. "By remembering that seeing it means I can sometimes change it." Sometimes, not always, not even usually, but sometimes is enough. 6 months later, Evangeline Thorne had her last prophecy. She was sitting in the general store, quietly purchasing supplies, when her eyes went wide and her body went rigid. The store owner, Pete Collins, reached for her as she began to convulse, her voice emerging in fragments. "Fire," she gasped. "Fire from the sky, metal birds, cities of glass turning to dust, children who never see grass, water that burns the throat, the last of the buffalo, the last of the wolves, the last ... She collapsed, blood trickling from her nose, her breathing shallow. Dr. Crowley was summoned, but there was nothing he could do. Evangeline Thorne lingered for 3 days, sometimes conscious, sometimes lost in visions of a future too strange and terrible to understand. On the third night, she opened her eyes one last time and looked directly at Sheriff Brennan. "The world is changing," she whispered. "Magic is dying. Soon there will be no more oracles, no more seers, no more women who speak to shadows. But maybe that's for the best." She closed her eyes and never opened them again.